The photograph was taken at precisely 3:47 in the afternoon, on Saturday, the 12th of September, 1874. The town of Haleworth, a soot-streaked junction between Leeds and York, was not accustomed to spectacle. Its citizens worked long hours in the mills and brickworks, and the only excitement most knew was payday or a Sunday sermon. Yet that week, the arrival of Merrin's Marvels traveling exhibition transformed the grey industrial square into a field of noise and color. The troupe had pitched its striped tent on a patch of flattened grass beside the abandoned Barrow Mill, where the air carried the scent of iron and burnt oil. Children followed the wagons as they rolled in, clattering and swaying, their sides painted with faded letters, "Wonders of nature and man, see what the world conceals." By dawn, the workers had raised the main tent, patched the holes with waxed cloth, and hung lanterns in a ring like a constellation waiting to be lit. At the edge of the fairground, Mr. Alastair Reed, a local photographer and amateur chemist, set up his tripod. His studio on Millgate had recently begun offering instantaneous portraits, but his equipment was far from portable. Still, Merrin, ever the self-promoter, insisted that a photograph be taken to commemorate their final show of the season. "Posterity loves a picture," he said with his easy grin. "Let the good people of Haleworth see our faces long after we've rolled on." So they assembled before the tent in the mid-afternoon sun, when the clouds broke and the light fell with rare generosity upon the muddy field. There were 32 souls in total, performers, musicians, handlers, and Merrin himself standing at the center, his top hat slightly askew. The camera captured a tableau that now seems both theatrical and unervingly still. Bruno the Strong, stripped to the waist, balanced an iron bar across his shoulders. Beside him stood the Glass Sisters, their skin so pale it reflected the light like porcelain. Lydia Quinn, the contortionist, knelt on the grass, twisting herself into a graceful arch as though mid-performance. At the front sat little Pike, the smallest clown, his painted smile faintly trembling, one hand clutching the mane of a patient pony. Behind them, the striped tent loomed like a great beast holding its breath. The letters on its banner shimmered unevenly in the light breeze. Merrin's Marvels, education, amusement, enlightenment. To modern eyes, the photograph appears strangely alive. The exposure required nearly 20 seconds, and in that span, tiny movements, breathing, blinking, a shift of weight, blurred the edges of their forms. Merrin's outline, in particular, seems to ripple faintly, as if the air around him refused to stay still. The pony's tail appears doubled, suggesting a flick between moments. Reed, in his notebook, later wrote, "Difficult light. Figures restless. Odd interference on the plate." No one at the time noticed the faint, dark smudge near the left corner of the image, an indistinct shape that does not match any shadow in the scene. Some who have examined the print in later years have suggested it might be a fault of the emulsion or a trick of dust. Others claim it resembles the curve of a human face turned away. When the session ended, Merrin thanked the photographer and paid him a shilling extra to develop 2 copies, one for the troupe's records, one to hang in the ticket booth. The group dispersed quickly afterward, anxious to prepare for that night's performance. The photograph was left to dry on a wire in Reed's studio as the sky began to darken with the approach of evening. By the time the lamps were lit in town, Reed had already forgotten about it. He returned after supper to find the image fully formed, the figures sharp and distinct. He admired it briefly, noting the proud yet weary expressions, the uneven smiles. Then, as he reached to remove it from the line, he thought, though he could not later say why, that one or two of the faces seemed subtly altered from how he remembered them. He dismissed the notion as fatigue. He placed the print in its case, locked up his studio, and went home. Hours later, as the wind picked up from the moors and the first rumble of thunder echoed across the valley, the tent of Merrin's Marvels glowed faintly against the night, a beacon of laughter and brass music on the outskirts of Haleworth. Within 5 hours, it would be gone, every performer, every beast, every scrap of canvas consumed. And in the morning, when the photographer returned to retrieve his payment, there would be nothing to photograph but ash. To understand Edmund Merrin, one must first understand the century that produced him. The 1870s were an age of industry and spectacle, of progress wrapped in soot. London hummed with invention and decay alike. Men spoke of the future while living knee-deep in the refuse of the present. It was in that paradox that Merrin found his genius. Born in 1828 in Bristol, the son of a dockside cooper, he grew up among barrels, salt water, and the shouts of the shipyards. His mother died when he was 8, leaving him to a father whose affection could be measured only in silence and rum. At 15, Merrin joined a traveling preacher's caravan as a hand, mending wheels and lifting crates. He stayed for 2 years, long enough to memorize the rhythm of the sermon, the sway of persuasion. He learned, as he later put it, how easily a crowd may be led to believe in what it already wishes were true. When the preacher died suddenly of fever, Merrin took his few belongings, a worn Bible, a set of brass spectacles, and a painted sign reading, "Salvation for the Curious," and struck out on his own. He drifted through fairs and marketplaces, performing tricks of rhetoric and sleight of hand, mixing scripture with illusion. By the age of 30, he had reinvented himself as Professor Merrin, lecturer on the marvels of nature and man. It began modestly, a cabinet of curiosities hauled behind a single horse. But Merrin possessed that rarest of commodities, a showman's instinct sharpened by intellect. He saw what the people hungered for: wonder, danger, the comfort of feeling superior to what frightened them. He gave it to them with charm and calculation. His exhibits grew. He acquired a glass tank to display a mermaid, a stitched-together concoction of fishtail and monkey torso. He purchased a mechanical bird that could whistle 3 notes when wound. He hired contortionists, strongmen, and those whom society had cast aside, people with twisted limbs, unusual growths, or peculiar talents. To the public, they were living phenomena. To Merrin, they were indispensable instruments in his grand orchestra of astonishment. Yet even his harshest critics admitted he treated his performers better than most. Wages were fair, meals regular, and he forbade cruelty from the audience. "You pay to look," he would tell the crowd, "not to mock. God made all things, and what you see tonight is but his variety." Whether those words were conviction or cleverness, no one could say. By 1868, Merrin's Marvels traveling exhibition had become a familiar sight across northern England. The red and cream tents appeared in mining towns, seaside resorts, even cathedral greens. Newspapers praised the troupe for blending education with entertainment. Merrin, always the strategist, donated small sums to local charities wherever they stopped, ensuring favorable press and access to town squares otherwise closed to performers. To his troupe, Merrin was both benefactor and enigma. He worked tirelessly, slept little, and kept meticulous ledgers in a leather-bound journal he never allowed anyone to read. He could be genial at breakfast and merciless by nightfall. Those who crossed him were dismissed quietly and without farewell. "There's no room for sentiment in a show," he once told Lydia Quinn after she hesitated to perform through an illness. "The curtain doesn't care who coughs behind it." Still, his charisma bound them. Even the weary and the wounded found in his ambition a strange comfort, a purpose that, however exploitative, gave them identity. Under his direction, they ceased to be outcasts and became marvels. Observers noted Merrin's peculiar fascination with machinery. He corresponded with inventors and electrical experimenters, purchasing odd devices from London workshops: magnet coils, voltaic cells, and copper plates etched with diagrams no one in his troupe understood. His most mysterious creation was the Electroman automaton, a life-sized figure of wood and brass that he claimed would one day move as though gifted with breath. It never worked in public, though he sometimes kept it on display in the tent's side pavilion, draped with velvet and lit by a single gas lamp. Those who saw it swore it looked almost human. Some said Merrin spoke to it in private, as if expecting a reply. By the summer of 1874, Merrin's fortunes had begun to wane. New circuses with grander budgets roamed the railways, and his troupe's equipment showed its age. But pride would not allow retreat. He announced a farewell tour of the northern provinces, promising performances that would outshine all before. And so, in early September, his wagons rolled into Hailworth, one last town, one last crowd, one last chance to prove that wonder was still worth the price of a ticket. None could know that for Merrin and his marvels, the curtain was about to fall forever. They called themselves a family, though none among them were bound by blood. The word was spoken half in jest, half in hope, a fragile shield against the loneliness that clung to life on the road. To the towns they visited, they were curiosities, amusements, shadows that passed and vanished with the morning fog. But within the canvas walls of Merrin's marvels, they were a strange, loyal congregation gathered around the pulpit of wonder. There were 32 performers in all, not counting the drivers and the horses. Each had been drawn to Merrin by circumstance, debt, or the quiet desperation of having nowhere else to go. They came from alleys and workhouses, from orphanages and ruined theaters, from corners of England where poverty was thicker than fog. Merrin never turned anyone away if they could earn applause. At the top of the bill stood Bruno the Strong, a former coal miner from Durham whose frame seemed carved from the very rock he once heaved. He could bend iron bars across his knee and lift 2 men on his shoulders. Beneath the grease and bluster, however, he was a gentle soul. Children adored him, and he often carved small wooden animals for them during long journeys. His hands, capable of lifting a horse, could smooth a splinter from a toy rabbit with tender patience. Beside him in the troop's hierarchy were the Glass sisters, Eleanor and Ruth, twins whose skin bore a faint blue translucence, a medical curiosity that made them appear almost ethereal under lamplight. In daylight the effect was ghostly. One could trace the pale veins along their arms as though they were painted glass. They sang in harmony, soft, haunting hymns that Merrin used to open his show. When they stood on stage in their white gowns, the crowd would fall silent, unsure whether to be moved or unnerved. Lydia Quinn, the contortionist, was the only one who had once known real fame. She had performed on proper stages in London until a fall from the rigging ruined her reputation and her spine alike. Merrin found her in a cheap boarding house, her body still pliant enough for spectacle, and promised her a second act. She wore her bitterness like a crown, yet in moments of calm she became almost maternal toward the younger performers, especially little Pike, the boy clown. Pike was 10 years old, though his smallness made him appear younger. He rarely spoke, communicating mostly through nods and gestures. Merrin had found him wandering near a Liverpool dock, dressed in rags and unable to recall his family name. The showman painted his face, gave him bells and a motley suit, and christened him Little Pike, the Prince of Laughter. Offstage, the boy spent his hours feeding the ponies and following Lydia like a shadow. Then there was Greta the Fire Lady, a towering woman from Hamburg who could breathe flames by spitting lamp oil across a torch. The audience saw danger, Merrin saw profit. Greta saw nothing at all. Her eyes had clouded with cataracts from years of smoke. Yet she knew her routine by instinct, moving with the assurance of one who trusted heat more than sight. They were joined by jugglers, musicians, dwarfs, and an old sailor who claimed to have once served aboard the Beagle. Their accents clashed, their tempers often flared, but when the drums began to beat each night, they became one organism, the show. After every performance, they would gather behind the tent in a ring of lantern light. Merrin, though often distant, joined them for supper, bread, salted meat, and weak ale. He would speak of destiny, of how their little company carried enlightenment to the provinces, reminding the common man of the world's divine strangeness. They listened, weary but spellbound, because it pleased him when they did. Yet beneath their laughter lay unease. They whispered of accidents, of wagons breaking in the night, of animals gone wild, of that strange automaton Merrin kept locked in its crate. Some swore they heard it hum softly, as if alive. Others claimed Merrin stayed up late polishing its brass skull, murmuring words none could decipher. Still, they followed him. For many, Merrin was the only man who had ever offered coin for what others mocked or feared. He gave them purpose and with it, a kind of dignity. But as the summer waned, even the performers could sense a heaviness settling over the camp, an invisible tension, like the air before a storm. Bruno began to complain of sleeplessness. The Glass sisters sang more softly, their harmonies faltering. Lydia's joints stiffened, little Pike grew pale and listless. When the wagons creaked into Haleworth, some among them joked it felt like the world's end. "One more show," Merrin had said, "and then we rest." And so they smiled for the photograph that would outlast them all, unaware that the next applause they heard would be swallowed by fire. The evening of September 12, 1874 descended upon Hailworth like a closing curtain. A thick, copper-colored haze hung in the air, the residue of a week's coal smoke mingled with the scent of wet grass from a recent drizzle. By 6 o'clock, a queue had already formed at the gate of Merrin's Marvels, stretching past the old mill road and down toward the canal. Men in soot-stained shirts clutched coins in their palms. Women in shawls whispered to children who fidgeted with excitement. The field itself was alive with noise, the stamping of horses, the clatter of tin cups, the faint wheeze of a calliope that struggled to hold a tune in the damp air. Lanterns were lit along the guy ropes, throwing trembling halos of gold against the striped canvas. The tent, patched and mended through years of travel, swelled slightly in the wind, exhaling smoke from the oil lamps inside. Backstage, the troupe prepared in a blur of motion and ritual. Lydia Quinn sat cross-legged on a crate, binding her wrists with silk strips to keep her joints warm. The Glass sisters rehearsed their hymn under their breath, their pale faces powdered to conceal the blue tint of their veins. Bruno paced near the entrance, rolling his shoulders and muttering a prayer taught by his mother, though he would have denied it if asked. Merrin moved among them like a conductor before an orchestra, every gesture deliberate. His top hat gleamed under the lanterns, his coat newly brushed, though the cuffs were frayed. He spoke in low tones, praise to one, warning to another, adjusting a collar here, a ribbon there. The troupe's anxiety seemed to melt beneath his presence. They believed, if only for those moments, that he could command not only their fate but the very elements themselves. At 7, the doors opened. The audience flooded in, 200 souls, perhaps more, filling the benches and aisles until the air grew thick with heat and breath. Mothers hushed crying infants, factory men laughed too loudly, the scent of ale mingled with grease paint and sawdust. The show began with music, a battered violin, a drum, and Greta's booming voice announcing the wonders to come. The Glass sisters followed, stepping into the circle of light and singing a fragile harmony that silenced even the drunkest heckler. Then came Bruno, lifting an anvil with theatrical ease, veins rising like cables under his skin. Each act unfolded with the steady rhythm of a well-rehearsed prayer. Merrin appeared last, striding to the center of the ring as though stepping into a pulpit. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, his voice rich and commanding, "tonight you shall glimpse the breadth of creation, the beauty, the terror, the divine invention of the Almighty Himself." The crowd roared. He gestured to Lydia, who began her contortion act, bending and folding her body through a brass hoop suspended from the rafters. The audience gasped as she twisted into shapes that seemed to defy anatomy. Merrin narrated with solemn awe, "Observe what marvels the human frame may conceal when touched by providence and perseverance." Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the moors. The first drops of rain hissed on the tent's roof, unnoticed amid the applause. When Lydia finished, Merrin bowed deeply and signaled for the final attraction, the Electroman Ottoman. Two stagehands wheeled forward a tall, velvet-draped cabinet that had been kept hidden all evening. The audience leaned forward, murmuring. Merrin lifted the cloth with a flourish. Inside stood the figure, human-shaped, gleaming brass and wood, its eyes small glass bulbs that reflected the lamps like tiny suns. "Behold," Merrin declared, "a creation of modern science, wherein the spark of life itself may be imitated." He turned a crank at its base, and the automaton's chest began to hum faintly. Its head tilted a fraction, mouth parting as though to breathe. A woman in the crowd screamed. Merrin smiled, delighted. This was precisely the reaction he desired. Yet something about the hum changed, a higher, keening pitch, like a wire drawn too tight. A faint whiff of ozone touched the air. Greta, watching from the side curtain, felt the hairs on her arms rise. Lydia, still catching her breath, whispered, "He's pushing it too far." But Merrin pressed on. "Progress demands courage," he shouted. "Let us not fear the future." At that moment, one of the lanterns flickered, its glass fogging with condensation. A droplet ran down, hissed against the flame, and the wick sputtered, only to flare twice as bright. The automaton's chest glowed briefly, unnaturally blue. The audience cheered, thinking it part of the act. Merrin laughed with them, his teeth flashing white. "You see, ladies and gentlemen?" Then the thunder broke directly overhead, and the sound of rain became a steady drumming against the tent. The ropes strained, the lamps guttered. For a heartbeat, all was spectacle, alive and electric. No one noticed the small arc of light that leapt from the automaton's hand to the oil-soaked rope near the stage floor. It was barely more than a spark, the smallest blue kiss of energy. But it was enough. It began as a flicker. A whisper of light, too small to notice in the storm of applause. When the spark leapt from the automaton's hand to the frayed rope near the stage, it hissed softly, like a match struck in prayer. For a moment, it seemed to die. Then the flame caught the oil-stained fibers, crawled along them with slow, deliberate hunger, and disappeared behind a painted backdrop. Inside the tent, the air was already thick and warm from hundreds of bodies and dozens of lamps. No one saw the first plume of smoke rise into the upper folds of canvas, curling against the shadows like a serpent. Lydia Quinn, bent over to untie her silks, caught the scent before anyone else, faint but unmistakable. She turned toward the back curtain and froze. "Merrin," she called softly, "something's burning." He did not hear her. He was still bowing, his face gleaming with sweat, his voice rising above the applause. "Ladies and gentlemen, the marvels of this age have only begun." The crowd cheered again, drowning her warning. Bruno stepped forward to help wheel the automaton away, but before he reached it, a shout rose from the far side of the stands, a woman's voice, sharp with alarm. Then another. Heads turned. Someone pointed upward. Above them, the tent's highest seam glowed orange. For a moment, it seemed almost beautiful, a flower of light blooming across the canvas ceiling. Then it split open, and the first tongue of fire dropped through. Chaos followed. Screams cut through the music. Benches overturned. Children cried. The audience surged toward the nearest exit, but the narrow flap jammed almost at once. Bodies pressed, tripped, clawed. The flames moved faster than thought, fed by oil, sawdust, and the varnish of the stage boards. Within seconds, the entire right side of the tent was a sheet of fire, roaring like a forge. Merrin shouted for order, but his voice vanished in the thunder of panic. Bruno threw himself at the rope line, tearing at knots with bare hands until the skin split. Lydia seized little Pike by the arm and pushed him toward an opening, but the boy froze, staring at the automaton now engulfed in sparks. The brass figure seemed to shimmer, its head still upright, its glass eyes reflecting the inferno. Then came the collapse. One of the main poles, weakened by the heat, buckled with a deep, cracking sound. The tent sagged inward, raining embers and flaming cloth. Greta the fire lady tried to beat the flames with a wet tarp, but her hair caught. She fell without a sound. Outside, townsfolk rushed from the fairground, shouting for water, for help, for God. Buckets were fetched from the canal, but the fire had already grown monstrous, feeding on wind and canvas. The sound was not like burning wood, it was a low, continuous moan, as if the tent itself were alive and screaming. Within minutes, the entire structure was ablaze. The light could be seen from the churchyard a mile away, an unnatural glow that turned the low clouds crimson. The smell reached even further: oil, flesh, horsehair, and rain-soaked ash. Some witnesses later claimed to have seen Merrin still inside, standing before the automaton as the fire closed around him. Others swore he had fled into the night, his coat aflame like a torch. No two accounts agreed. By 9:30, the tent had collapsed entirely. The last cries faded beneath the hiss of rain, which fell too late to matter. Only smoldering timber and the twisted frame of the automaton remained visible through the smoke, and even that, by morning, would be gone. When the fire finally died, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. The field steamed. What had been a carnival ground was now a blackened hollow. The surviving townsfolk gathered at a distance, their faces pale with reflected light. None dared approach until dawn. The local constable wrote in his notebook, "Fire of unknown origin. Entire company lost." several townspeople among the dead. Cause uncertain, perhaps an accident with oil lamp. But the men who had stood closest, those who had seen the spark leap from the automaton's hand, would tell a different story in whispers, that the machine had moved, that it had glowed too brightly, as if something unseen had passed through it. The official report, when it came, mentioned none of that. By midnight, the rain fell harder, washing away footprints, soaking the last embers until they hissed and vanished. Nothing remained of Merrin's marvels but smoke and a strange metallic scent that lingered for days. And beneath the ruin, in the soaked earth where the automaton had stood, the ground was scorched, not black, but a peculiar shade of blue. Morning came reluctantly to Haleworth. A thin fog drifted from the canal, settling low over the blackened field where Merrin's marvels had stood. The air still smelled of smoke and wet ashes, heavy and bitter. A few townsfolk gathered at the edge of the ruin, hats in hand, speaking in hushed voices as if afraid to wake something sleeping beneath the debris. The constable, Edward Bligh, arrived with 2 men from the mill to begin the grim work of counting the dead. They moved slowly through the wreckage, boots sinking into the mud. What had been a bright field of color and sound the night before was now a charred wasteland. The bones of tents, the twisted rims of wagon wheels, melted glass from lanterns pooled like amber in the dirt. "God's mercy," one of the men muttered, stooping to lift a scorched hoop from the ashes. It was all that remained of Lydia Quinn's silks. Bligh recorded each discovery in his ledger. Unidentified female, possibly performer. Male adult, burned severe. Partial remains, likely animal. The handwriting grew shakier as the morning wore on. By mid-afternoon, the tally reached 27 confirmed dead, 14 from the troupe, 13 townsfolk who had come to see the show. But there were names missing. Most notably, Professor Merrin. No body was found among the ruins. Thornton, too, was gone. Only a blackened outline remained in the mud where it had stood, and within that outline, the earth was strangely discolored, a pale bluish tint that resisted explanation. When Bligh pressed his boot against it, he felt a faint warmth, though the rain had been falling for hours. The townspeople crossed themselves. Some claimed the professor had perished in the blaze and been reduced to nothing by divine judgment. Others whispered that he had escaped, that they'd seen a tall figure limping toward the canal road while the fire raged behind him. By nightfall, rumor had spread faster than the flames ever had. Children spoke of a burning man wandering the moors, his eyes glowing like the automaton's. Housewives locked their shutters and prayed. The vicar, Reverend Cole, delivered a sermon on the dangers of pride and the folly of playing at creation. 2 days later, the remnants of the troupe were buried in a communal grave at the edge of the churchyard. The coffins were small and hastily built, many only half-filled. A single headstone was raised, its inscription brief. "Here lie the performers of Merrin's marvels. May their souls find rest where fire cannot reach." Only a few townspeople attended. The others stayed away, muttering that curses clung to those who trafficked in unnatural wonders. After the funeral, Constable Bligh returned once more to the site. The rain had stopped, but the ground still steamed faintly. He crouched by the burned-out center, notebook in hand, and found something half-buried, a fragment of brass no larger than a coin. When he wiped away the soot, he saw fine etchings across its surface, concentric circles, delicate as a clockmaker's design, and at the center, a faint mark resembling an eye. He pocketed it without mentioning it in his report. That night, as he sat in his office copying the final account, the lamps flickered. The air smelled briefly of ozone, sharp and metallic. He paused, pen hovering over the page. From the far corner of the room came a faint hum, low and constant, like the vibration of a tuning fork. He searched for the source but found nothing. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun. When he looked down again, his inkwell had tipped, spreading a dark pool across the ledger. The ink shimmered faintly, blue under the lamplight. Bligh closed the book and said nothing. Within a week, the fairground was cleared. The town council declared the area unsafe for further gatherings, and wild grass began to reclaim the scorched earth. But at night, travelers passing along the canal road reported a strange light over the field, not fire, but a steady glow that pulsed like breath. One old bargeman swore he'd seen a figure standing in that light, a tall man in a black coat, bareheaded, face turned toward the ruins. When the man raised his hand, the light brightened, and the bargeman fled without looking back. The constable dismissed the tale, of course. Yet in the margin of his private notes, he later added one final line, written in cramped letters. The professor's eyes were said to be blue. The inquest into the fire at Merrin's Marvels was convened on the 21st of September 1874 in the parish hall of Haleworth. The building, usually reserved for harvest festivals and the occasional wedding, smelled faintly of damp wood and candle wax. Now it had been transformed into a courtroom of sorts, a long table for the magistrate and coroner, benches for the witnesses, and a cluster of townsfolk pressed together at the back, whispering like parishioners at a funeral. At the head of the table sat Coroner Jonathan Pell, a narrow man with thinning hair and an expression that suggested perpetual disappointment in the world. He tapped a small wooden gavel for silence, though the murmurs did not fully subside. The fire had left the town uneasy, not merely because of the deaths, but because of the stories that had followed. Some claimed the blaze had burned too hot, too fast. Others swore they had heard voices within the flames. "Let us keep to facts," Pell said, clearing his throat. "Superstition has no place in the king's record." The first witness was Constable Edward Bligh. He rose stiffly and gave his account in measured tones. The discovery of the remains, the missing automaton, the absence of Professor Merrin's body. He omitted the brass fragment and the strange humming in his office. Those details he could not bring himself to speak aloud. When asked about the cause, Bligh hesitated. "It appears," he said slowly, "that an oil lamp was overturned during the exhibition. The flame caught the canvas, and the fire spread from there." "And this electroman," Pell pressed, "was it in operation at the time?" "Yes, sir. The professor was demonstrating it when the first spark was seen." A murmur rippled through the hall. One of the jurors, a cooper by trade, leaned toward his neighbor. "I told you, didn't I? That machine was cursed." "Order!" the coroner barked. Next came Samuel Creel, a carpenter who had been seated near the stage that night. His hands shook as he spoke. "There was a light, sir. Bright as lightning, but blue. It came from the thing's chest. Then the air went queer, hot and cold both at once. I swear, my hair stood on end." Pell frowned. "And you're certain this was before the fire began?" "Just before I—" Several witnesses corroborated the account, each adding details more strange than the last. One claimed the automaton had raised its arm, another that it had spoken Merrin's name. The coroner scribbled furiously, his pen scratching like an insect's legs. Then came Reverend Cole, summoned to offer a statement on moral context. He adjusted his collar and regarded the crowd with solemn authority. "I warned the professor," he said. "I told him that man was not meant to imitate God's creation. He spoke of harnessing the divine spark, and see what came of it. Fire, death, and ruin." Pell sighed. "Reverend, we are here to determine cause, not sin." Cole's eyes flashed. "The two are not so easily separated." When the Reverend stepped down, the room buzzed with tension. Some nodded in agreement, others looked away, unwilling to dwell on such notions. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and the sound seemed to echo through the hall like distant thunder. The final witness was Mary Henshaw, a young seamstress who had helped stitch the troops' costumes. She spoke quietly, but the room grew still as she described the professor's last evening. "He came to my workshop the morning before the show," she said. "He asked for blue thread. Said it conducted better. I thought he meant electricity, but when I asked, he smiled and said, 'No, thought.'" The coroner blinked. "Thought?" "Yes, sir. He said blue held it best." No one spoke after that. Even Pell, ever skeptical, found himself staring at the inkpot on his desk, noticing for the first time how it caught the light, how faintly blue it appeared. At length, he cleared his throat and read the conclusion. "The jury finds that the fire was accidental, caused by an electrical device exhibited by Professor Merrin. Said professor presumed dead. No further inquiry warranted." The gavel struck. The matter, in official terms, was closed. But as the townsfolk filed out, Constable Bligh lingered near the door. From somewhere beyond the hall came a low vibration, barely audible, the same faint hum he had heard before. He turned toward the window, but there was only mist outside, and the faintest shimmer of blue light spreading across the darkened sky. He said nothing, though he knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that Merrin's story was not over. Autumn settled heavily over Haleworth. The fields beyond the town turned the color of rust, and the canal carried a scum of fallen leaves that drifted like idle thoughts. The fire had become a story now, retold in pubs and parlors, softened by rumor yet sharpened by fear. The council fenced off the scorched ground where Merrin's marvels had stood, posting a weathered sign that read, "No trespassing by order of the magistrate." Yet still people went. Boys dared each other to slip through the fence at dusk, to bring back proof of ghosts. They spoke of strange lights under the soil, of humming that rose when you pressed your ear to the earth. One boy returned pale and shaking, insisting he had heard music, the faint, cracked notes of a calliope playing in the distance where no instrument remained. Constable Bligh dismissed these tales, though each new report left him uneasy. The nights had grown restless since the inquest. He had taken to walking the lanes alone, unable to sleep, listening to the creak of signboards and the whisper of reeds. Sometimes, he fancied he heard footsteps behind him, steady and deliberate, matching his own. When he turned, the road was empty. Then came the letter. It arrived without a postmark, slipped under the station door one foggy morning. The envelope was damp and smelled faintly of smoke. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in an elegant, familiar hand. "Edward, the mechanism survives. It seeks completion. Meet me where the fire began. Midnight." There was no signature, only a faint circular mark pressed into the paper, a design of interlocking rings, like the pattern on the brass fragment Bligh had hidden in his drawer. He read the note 3 times before locking it away. Yet by nightfall, he found himself walking toward the fairground. The moon hung low and swollen, half veiled by mist. The path was slick with dew, the grass whispering around his boots. When he reached the fence, the sign lay flat, trampled into the mud. Beyond it, the field seemed to breathe, faint steam curling upward from the blackened soil, as if something beneath still smoldered. Bligh hesitated. Then he saw it, a faint blue light flickering near the center, pulsing like the heart of a dying fire. He moved closer, one cautious step at a time. At the center of the ruin, where the automaton had once stood, the ground was split open. The soil glowed faintly, the color of a struck match just before it dies. And from that glow rose the outline of something metallic, a curve of brass, a hand, a piece of jaw. The fragments lay half buried, arranged not by chance but by some guiding intent, as if the earth itself had been shaping them. Bligh knelt. The air trembled with a low hum, deep enough to feel in the bones. He reached toward the nearest piece, but before his fingers touched it, the light flared bright, blinding blue-white. He stumbled back, heart hammering. When his vision cleared, he saw movement in the mist, a tall shape standing where the light had been. It was a man, or what had once been one. The outline was unmistakable, the long coat, the high collar, the gloved hands. His face was pale, the features half obscured by soot, yet the eyes burned with cold luminescence. "Professor," Bligh whispered. The figure tilted its head slightly as though listening. Then it spoke, or rather, the air around it vibrated with a sound that resembled speech but carried no breath. "Completion," it said. "The design is not ended." Bligh stumbled backward, tripping over a broken beam. "You're dead," he gasped. "We buried you." The figure raised its hand. For an instant, light coursed along the seams of its coat, blue threads of fire that traced veins not of flesh but of metal. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the glow dimmed. "Energy is only change," it murmured. "Change is continuation." A gust of wind tore through the field, scattering ash and steam. When Bligh looked again, the figure was gone. Only the faint hum remained, fading into silence. He fled the field and did not stop until the first lamps of the town appeared ahead of him. His hands trembled so violently he could not fit the key into his own door. At dawn, he returned with 2 laborers, claiming there had been trespassers on the site. But when they reached the center of the ruin, the soil was still, the brass gone, the ground cold to the touch. Only one thing remained, a single footprint pressed into the ash. Not of leather or boot, but of something smooth, hard, and perfectly formed.